You know, it's so easy to get lost in the day-to-day headlines, but we all really want to understand the forces shaping our world, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what we're doing today.
Right.
We're taking a deep dive into all the different perspectives surrounding the Ukraine conflict.
Okay.
And more broadly, how countries are kind of interacting on the global stage.
Right.
And we've got some really fascinating expert analysis to unpack here.
Cool.
So our mission today is to really pull out those key insights.
Okay.
Like what might happen next in this conflict?
Hey.
What role can Europe realistically play? And where do the U.S. and China fit into all of this?
Right.
Okay, let's jump right into what this expert had to say.
Right.
So one of the most interesting points right off the bat is about Europe's capacity to support Ukraine in the long term. You know, can they really stand on their own?
Yeah.
And this expert is saying that it's not looking so good. There are some serious limitations in two key areas.
Okay.
Their finances and their ability to produce all that military equipment that's needed on such a large scale.
I see.
So basically they're saying Europe might not be able to simply step in and replace the level of support that the U.S. has been giving.
Right.
And it goes a bit further than that.
Okay.
The analysis suggests that if the fighting just continues on this path, Ukraine may end up actually losing more territory and, tragically, more lives without a clear way to win outright.
Wow.
So the point here is that Europe's potential dependence on the U.S. could make Ukraine really vulnerable in the long run.
Exactly. And that ties into the broader critique of European foreign policy over the last maybe 15, 17 years or so.
Okay.
There's this turning point that's highlighted around 2008.
Okay.
And this was when there were those discussions and moves towards expanding NATO to include Ukraine and Georgia.
Right. So that was a big moment.
Yeah.
And the analysis suggests that despite some initial hesitation among some European countries, they ultimately aligned with that U.S. push for NATO expansion.
I see.
And the argument here is that since then, Europe hasn't really found its own truly independent voice when it comes to foreign policy.
It's like they've been following someone else's lead.
Right, exactly.
So this raises a big question.
Yeah.
What kind of foreign policy could Europe actually have realistically?
Yeah, that's a great question.
The idea here is that a truly independent approach would need to be built on Europe's own military capabilities and their diplomatic strengths.
Okay.
But with a focus on de-escalating conflicts, not just supporting the continuation of them.
Right. A different way of thinking.
Yeah. And there's a specific point made about Europe's diplomatic efforts.
Okay.
They point out all those frequent high-level meetings with President Zelensky.
Right.
Which are important, of course.
Yeah, it's definitely.
But they also point to a lack of consistent and direct diplomatic engagement with President Putin. And the argument is that any real path to resolving this, it probably needs those direct lines of communication, right?
Makes sense. You need to talk to find a solution.
Exactly.
So another big theme that comes up is this question of trust, particularly with Putin.
Okay.
You know, you always hear people saying, how can we trust Putin?
Right, right.
But what's interesting here is that the analysis challenges that whole framework.
Okay, how so?
It points to the U.S. itself.
Okay.
And whether the U.S. has always strictly stuck to every international agreement it's made, suggesting that trust in international politics, it's rarely absolute.
Right.
It really depends on, you know, mutual interests and those enforcement mechanisms in place.
That's a good point. It's not just about whether we like or trust someone.
Right, exactly. It's more about the system.
Yeah, the incentives, the structures.
Right. So the analysis then moves on to what a potential peace agreement might look like.
Okay.
And it stresses that a truly effective, lasting agreement between Ukraine and Russia, it wouldn't just be a bilateral deal.
Okay.
It can't just be between those two countries.
Right.
They're saying it needs broad international support and understanding.
Okay.
So it has weight beyond just those two nations.
Okay.
And their reasoning is that if a major player like Russia just blatantly violates a globally recognized agreement, there would be serious consequences.
Okay.
Especially with their relationships with trade partners, financial partners, diplomatic partners like India and China.
So they're more likely to uphold it if it's not just a deal with one other country.
Exactly. That wider global backing and the threat of diplomatic and economic blowback.
Right.
It acts as a much stronger safeguard than just a simple agreement between two countries.
So where would they establish such a treaty?
Well, they suggest the UN Security Council.
Okay.
potentially with additional guarantor nations like India and Turkey.
Interesting.
To really lend that extra weight.
Okay, so now that brings us to the U.S.
Yeah, the U.S. role and perspective in all this and the analysis presented here is pretty critical. They're saying that the U.S. basically led Ukraine into this trap.
Wow.
And therefore bears a lot of responsibility, if not primary responsibility, for where things are now.
That's a strong statement.
It is.
So how do they connect that to the current administration?
Well, they bring up Trump's past conversations with Zelensky.
Okay.
Where he reportedly said that Ukraine had a losing hand.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
The implication seems to be that the current administration inherited a very difficult situation.
Right, a situation that was maybe strategically compromised already.
Exactly. And going further, the analysis actually calls the Biden administration's handling of this conflict incompetent. And they say it's been detrimental to the interests of Ukraine, the U.S. itself, and the world as a whole.
So a pretty negative assessment of U.S. policy then.
Yeah, definitely a sense of disappointment and concern there.
And what about the speaker's own past warnings?
Right. They talk about how they previously warned Ukraine about potentially becoming the Afghanistan of Europe.
That's pretty striking.
Yeah, it really highlights this long-standing worry about the potential downsides of their geopolitical alignment.
Right. Getting too close to the U.S.
Exactly. And there's this almost chilling quote they bring up.
Oh.
It's attributed to Henry Kissinger.
Wow. Okay.
Apparently shared with Ukrainian officials. And it warns about the dangers of being both an adversary and an ally of the United States.
So basically, you don't want to be on either side of the U.S.
Right, at least according to Kissinger.
That's a powerful statement.
It is. So now, shifting focus to Ukraine itself.
Okay.
The analysis argues that Zelensky's current stance, his policies, they might not actually reflect what most Ukrainians want.
That's a bold claim.
It is. They're saying that a large portion of Ukrainians just want peace.
Okay.
Even if it means making tough concessions, giving up territory. And there's concern about all those young Ukrainians being sent to fight with what they call insufficient training and equipment.
That's a worrying thought.
It is. And they go on to describe Zelensky as essentially ruling by martial law, which raises questions about how much public opinion is really factoring into decisions right now.
So given all that, what are the potential paths towards peace that they see?
Well, they really emphasize that Ukraine needs a real peace agreement.
Right.
Not just a ceasefire, a temporary pause.
Yeah, a lasting solution.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they specifically point to the Istanbul draft agreement from April 2022 as a sensible starting point for negotiations.
So are they saying that the current approach isn't working?
Yeah, their argument is that the longer this goes on, the more territory Ukraine stands to lose.
I see.
And they actually point to what they call terrible mistakes by the Ukrainian government in the past.
Okay, like what?
Well, they bring up the pursuit of NATO membership, the fact that they didn't fully implement the Minsk agreements.
The Minsk agreements, those were meant to de-escalate the conflict in the Donbass, right?
Exactly, back in 2014.
Right.
And then the decision not to sign that Istanbul draft agreement when it was on the table, they're suggesting that all these decisions were influenced, at least in part, by guidance and reassurance from, guess who? The U.S.
So they're placing a lot of blame on the U.S. for the current situation.
Yeah, that seems to be the through line here.
Okay, so what about China?
Right, let's talk about China's position in the world.
Okay.
The analysis here challenges this idea of China as this inherently expansionist power.
That's interesting.
They take a very long view of history.
Like how long are we talking?
Like 2,000 years.
Wow, okay.
They point to China's land borders, the natural barrier of the Himalayas with India.
Right.
And they argue that historically, China hasn't been focused on expanding outward. Over vast distances, like building those big overseas empires.
Right.
Instead, they put forward the view that it's actually the U.S. that has held this dominant global position since World War II. Taking over from Great Britain. Asserting control over the oceans.
So they're saying that this is a point of tension with China.
Yeah, because China's economic prosperity is heavily reliant on access to those global trade routes.
Right, those sea lanes are crucial for them.
Exactly, and the analysis highlights some really key ones.
Like which ones?
the Straits of Malacca,
Okay.
the South China Sea, the East China Sea.
Right. Those are all vital for Chinese trade.
Absolutely. And they bring up this long-standing U.S. policy of containment towards China,
Okay.
often referred to as the first island chain strategy.
The first island chain. Can you remind us what that is?
Sure. It's basically a series of islands stretching from Japan down to the Philippines and Indonesia, seen by some U.S. strategists as a natural barrier to contain China.
I see.
And this is where they introduce the idea of a security dilemma between the U.S. and China.
Okay, what does that mean?
So basically, actions taken by China that they see as defensive, like militarizing those atolls in the South China Sea.
Right.
The U.S. often interprets them as aggressive and threatening.
I see.
And that just leads to this cycle of mistrust and potential escalation.
Right. So it's a misunderstanding of intentions.
Exactly. And the analysis criticizes U.S. moves like forming all these alliances and partnerships around China.
Okay.
They specifically mention those long-standing alliances with South Korea and Japan.
Right.
And then more recent groupings like AUKUS and the Quad.
Yeah, I've been hearing a lot about those.
Right. And the speaker is concerned that these kinds of blocs can just make things worse.
Exacerbate the tension.
Exactly. And they really stress the importance of seeing security concerns from both sides. Like they bring up NATO expansion again.
Right.
And how Russia sees that as a direct threat.
Yeah, that makes sense from their perspective.
Exactly. And they also mention the situation with Taiwan.
Okay.
And how the U.S. increasing arms sales to Taiwan could be seen as a provocation by Beijing.
So they're urging more understanding and less kind of poking the bear?
Exactly. And they move on to talk about economic policies.
Okay.
And they're very clear about their stance on protectionism.
What's their take?
They're not a fan. They bring up the example of India. And how their economy grew relatively slowly during their period of protectionist policies after independence. And they contrast that with the huge positive impact of opening up the Indian economy in the 90s.
So they're arguing for a more open global economy.
Exactly. They make a similar point about China's massive growth after their market reforms.
Right. So the idea is that competitiveness on the global stage is key.
Right. And they're concerned about the current trend in the U.S. Towards breaking those established international supply chains.
Yeah, that seems to be happening more and more.
They think it could lead to higher costs and less competitive industries domestically.
Interesting. And what about tariffs?
Tariffs are a big no-no for them. They see them as a strategic mistake.
Got it. So who are the big players they see in this global landscape?
They identify 4 major powers.
Okay, who are they?
The U.S., Russia, China, and India.
So the usual suspects.
Yeah. And their reasoning is that those countries have large economies, nuclear capabilities, and advanced tech sectors.
Makes sense. Those are all markers of global power.
Exactly. And they throw in an interesting note about Europe.
Okay.
They say that if Europe were more unified in their foreign policy, they could be a 5th major power.
Interesting. A potential player to watch.
Definitely.
So lastly, they talk about India's role on the world stage.
Yeah, and there's a strong belief that India should have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council.
Okay.
They acknowledge that China might be the main obstacle right now.
Right, that makes sense.
But they suggest that Beijing could eventually come around to supporting it.
Interesting.
And they're very clear that they don't want the US and India to gang up on China. They favor normal, good relations between those 2 Asian powers.
So they see a more collaborative path forward.
Yeah, and their overall feeling is that India having that permanent seat would be a really positive thing for global stability.
That makes sense. Giving more representation to a major player like India.
Exactly. So this whole deep dive into these expert perspectives on Ukraine and the bigger picture of global relations, it really highlights just how complex things are.
Yeah, it's a tangled web for sure.
Definitely. And understanding these different viewpoints, it's crucial for navigating all the challenges we face.
Absolutely. It makes you think about the long-term consequences of all these decisions being made right now.
It really does.
So a final thought for you to consider.
Okay.
What if, instead of all this military buildup and these unilateral actions, what if there was a renewed focus on diplomacy, on addressing mutual security concerns?
That's an interesting idea.
Could that actually lead to a more positive and stable world?
It's something to think about.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.